Ryan. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm super excited to get to interview you. I would love if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, hey Courtney, thanks for having me. I'm Ryan Dalton. I am a teen fiction author. My most recent came out this year, and it's a middle grade called This Last Adventure, about a boy who uses storytelling to try to save his grandfather's memories from Alzheimer's.
Love that. I would love if you could tell us a little bit more about your books.
Sure, yeah. I write lots of different things. Typically centered on teen fiction. I just really like that voice. But my first books were a series of time travel mysteries, and the first one of those, called The Year of Lightning, came out in 2016. So yeah, I was hard at work on those for several years, and until we got all three of those out, I was super happy with that series. And then when I was thinking about like what to do next, I always have an insurmountable list of stories I would love to write, and I'm always adding more to it. So it's always a process to pick the next project. But my grandfather had been dealing with Alzheimer's for quite some time, and I had actually my mom telling me, with I know you like to write a lot of the sci-fi stuff, but your biggest strengths are with character and dialogue. You could probably write a pretty good story about a family dealing with the stuff that we're dealing with. Um, and I resisted for quite a while. I would say at least a solid year. I was like, I don't want to. I don't want to write something depressing, because your brain has to live in that forever. And um, it didn't feel like me. But I never could quite like walk away from the idea. So I would come back to it occasionally and just kind of noodle around and think, well, if I was going to, how would I do it? What would my story sound like? And then the key story element that occurred to me that really changed everything was Archie, the young boy, using creating these shared fantasy worlds with his grandfather, and using his grandfather's journal as the reference for it, as a way to try to preserve his memories. That at that point, I said that sounds like something I would write, and I was off and running since then, and now it's a real book out in the world.
I love that. What inspired you to write your books?
I said, ever since, I mean, not long after I learned to read, I started saying I was going to write books. Just one of those things, you hear somebody who is an actor, they said, I wanted to be on stage, since I first saw a stage, and comedians will say that. And I used to really kind of marvel at that, but then I realized, well, I did the same thing. I remember at like 6 to 8 years old telling people that I was going to write books, and I remember them laughing. And I remember at that age being confused about why they were laughing, thinking, I mean it. So I always knew I wanted to write. It took me until I was an adult to do more than just treat it as a hobby. Um, but I've always loved stories, and just always found them like they're just one of my favorite things, and always wrote stories and told stories in different ways. And but then, yeah, when I finally decided, I want to do this as more than a hobby, I want to do it professionally. That's when I started really diving in seriously, and like focusing on learning the actual craft of it, so that I could do it in a way still that I enjoyed, but also that I felt like I was doing it well. And after a couple of years of that really intense practice with just about every possible thing I could write. I mean, I wrote for comedy blogs. I did freelance advertising. I wrote tons of short stories, just to rack up experience. And then when I thought I was ready, that's when I pulled out the notebook I had at the time with the ideas so far that I had come up with for books. And I said, okay, I'm ready. So which of these ideas is really jumping out at me? And the one that I thought seemed the most different, the most unique, that I could do something interesting with, was a story of a twin boy and a girl, teenagers, who live across the street from a house with no doors. And there's only windows, but at one point when they're walking by the house, they look up at that house, and they see someone looking at them down through the window of the house without knowing how they could get in or out. And I loved that picture, and that scene in my head. And I started building things around that scene, and here we are, and it's a trilogy.
I love that. When you were writing your books, who were you thinking of when it comes to who your books are for?
Technically, the main characters are teenagers, but I never see my books as just for one set of people. I tend to think of it, even though I don't like write in this tone, but I tend to think of them almost like how Pixar handles their work. Even though I don't write that type of story, I always think of it as them as working on multiple levels. So there's a level that I think teens of a similar age that are going through what teens of that age go through, I think we'll be able to identify with that. I tend to have a pretty large cast of characters in all my books that allows me to have different points of view from people. And so in those books and in this latest book, there's also adults, and there's teenagers from different backgrounds as well. And so they all get to bounce off each other and play off of each other. So when people ask, like, okay, who are your books good for? I always tell them they're on the shelf for teenagers of a certain age range. So it's definitely very friendly for them. But I've had people from that age all the way up to people in their 80s read them and tell them that they enjoyed them. So I try to say they're more like crossover books that are just targeted a little more towards teens.
Love that. And I know you've touched on this, but how long have you been writing and what made you really sit down and start to write your books?
So I have been writing. I put pen to paper, figuratively, it was a keyboard, for the Year of Lightning. I started writing it in January 2011. A couple of years before that is when I was doing those really intensive, like couple of years of practice. So it took me 2 years to write the Year of Lightning. It took another 2 years to get it to where it was ready on and sell it. Honestly, it was probably the first year of that when I was querying and learning how to query also, but also learning there were things about the industry and what they wanted, what they look for that I didn't know yet. So a couple of parts of the book went through some revisions in those couple of years. And by the end of those 2 years is when I sold that book, and the publisher liked it enough that they basically just asked, can you give us a brief idea of where you would want to go with the other two books? And so I gave them just a brief outline of that, and they liked it enough that they bought the whole trilogy right there. So I was able to, it was nice. I was able to commit to the whole thing right from the very beginning. But yeah, technically 2011 is when I started writing the first book. And it was largely because, I mean, I had grown up and always loved writing, but never really saw a way to make it, work as a profession. And I was distracted with life and other things. And then also from my teens up into my mid-20s, I had a very severe yet undiagnosed sleeping disorder that I was a zombie essentially. But I didn't really realize how much of a zombie I was until I had sleep studies done, and they said basically, we have no idea how you're upright, and if we don't fix this, you're probably not going to live past 40. So I got surgery, I got treatment and everything, and it was like I became a whole different person. And actually, it was less than a year after the surgery and getting treatment that I started writing the first book. It was like I woke up and I was finally able to look beyond just how to survive day to day and actually work at something, like do more than just come home from work and completely crash because that was all that I had energy for. And so I kind of feel like ever since then I've been making up for the lost time, the lost couple of decades. And so I've just been writing and nonstop and doing lots of other things that I've been wanting to do. And at that point, I was also ready to. I had been working in a corporate environment and in a very corporate field, and it never did anything for me. It paid the bills. It was a good job as far as financially, but it didn't. If it's going to sound pretentious to say, it didn't feed the soul, but it didn't. So I remember there was one day I was sitting at the desk at work, and it was when I was starting to kind of wake up, and it was a bad day. It was a day that was frustrating. I remember sitting there thinking, not only is this stressful, but it's nothing that contributes anything real to anything in the world at all. It's completely meaningless. And I felt like I was literally just trading 8 hours a day for a nice paycheck. And I just couldn't stand it. And so I started looking at, okay, what else am I good at that if I really applied myself to, I think I can make a living off of? And that's when I said, well, I always said I was going to write books. So why don't I put my money where my mouth is and really go at it hard?
I love that. What's your schedule like when you're writing a book?
I try to treat it like a job. So I'm pretty consistent. You can't just wait for inspiration. You gotta keep to whatever your program is. So I typically write about 4 days a week, and I'm a pretty heavy outliner. So at any given time, whatever stage I'm in, I usually know what I'm going to be working on anyway, which is helpful because I can kind of prepare my mind to get into whatever I'm going to do. Um, I set aside very specific times. I try to give each of those days enough of a window that it's not like I'm like, okay, I got to sit down and create something in like an hour and a half. I try to give myself a bigger window just to let things breathe and to just really be able to get into what I'm doing rather than just try to sit and bang something out. Um, so yeah, in general, that's my process. It's funny, I'm probably more organized and regimented in writing than I am with anything else in my life. I'm not as organized as I would like to be, but when it comes to writing, I can do it.
That's amazing. What do you need in your writing space to help you stay focused?
Um, when I am outlining, I typically do that at home, and I use in the whole process. I use lots of music to help me kind of get in the mood and set the mood. Characters and scenes and whole projects have their own soundtracks and things that really helps me immerse myself in either someone's personality or like the tone and rhythm of a scene. So that really helps a lot. But yeah, like I said, when I'm outlining, it's typically at home. Um, I have an obscenely large computer screen at home that I like using for that because the outlining software that I use, it works in kind of a timeline fashion, and I love being able to see it. It's like the evolution of what I did at the start, which is for the first trilogy. I actually used a blank wall, and I covered the whole wall in a timeline with sticky notes, and each sticky note was a key moment, whether it's in the plot or character development. And so I can do that in software now. But I like using the bigger screen. But once I'm ready to write, I don't like writing at home. So I will go out, whether it's to a library or a coffee shop or whatever. I like the energy of being out. I don't like it just being me in my quiet house. But I also it's kind of funny. I also don't like the noise of wherever I'm going to be, so I wear noise canceling headphones. So I guess I want it both ways, but thanks to noise canceling headphones, I can have it.
Love that. What is your favorite writing snack or drink?
I wasn't a coffee drinker until I started writing, and, and then I mean it's a cliche for a reason why a lot of us write in coffee shops. I wrote, I would say, minimum half of my time travel trilogy in coffee shops. I wrote probably 80% of this last adventure in coffee shops. So I really have over the years developed a real taste for coffee. I don't eat when I'm writing. Um, I have learned just through trial and error that if I eat, it just becomes mealtime. And so I don't get any writing done. I've also learned that I can't have any um, like beer or anything like no alcohol at all because like as soon as the first sip touches my lips, it's like it's time to quit work. That's what my brain is like. It just switches off. It's like, oh, we're relaxing now. So yeah, only stimulants when I'm writing.
Love that. What type of books do you enjoy personally reading?
A huge variety, and it's actually grown. type of things that I've started reading and been, I don't want to say been willing to read, but the things that I've started reading as I've become an author and started making friends that are authors. And I want to support them and I want to read their books. And they come from all walks, all genres. And so I end up reading things that I wouldn't have read before and loving things that I wouldn't have ever thought to pick up. So, I mean, my first loves that I always go back to, I love a good mystery. I love fantasy. I love a good sci-fi. Mostly genre stuff. That's what I would naturally gravitate towards. But I read tons of children's books now because I know a ton of children's book authors. Um, and there are some amazingly well done, just contemporary stories that I wouldn't have thought I would read, and then I ended up writing a contemporary, which I never thought I would do. So yeah, I would say I am open to just about anything if it sounds interesting. Um, which I try to encourage now that I realized I was that way as a kid too, and I think kids tend to be a lot more like that. Like if they don't limit themselves as much, if it sounds good, they'll read it. So I try to call that out with kids and say, hey, don't lose that. Adults tend to really just because we have limited time and attention, we tend to really just say, okay, this is what I like, and I'm not going to look beyond. But man, we're missing some really great books if we do that. So I had to relearn that as an adult. That genre ultimately doesn't matter if it's a great story.
Love that. So true. Are there any books or authors that inspired you to become a writer?
Yeah. So yeah, I'm trying to think. There's ones that I loved that loving them made me think I want to do that as well. And then there's ones that I think more directly were inspiring. So I was a huge Hardy Boys Mysteries fan as a kid. I had stacks of those and I would just devour them over and over and over again. And then the early sci-fi that I can remember loving was the Wrinkle in Time series, which is funny that I loved those two, and then the first books I ended up writing were time travel mysteries. So maybe not a coincidence there. So I would say those are definitely influences. Um, but I also I'm influenced by a lot of different media as well. It's not just books. Well, for one, now I get inspired by being around colleagues, fellow authors, and seeing what they're doing. And that's very energizing to me, both to enjoy reading books and to get back into working on my own books. It's good fuel. And then if I watch a particularly good movie or TV show that I really admire how it's written, I get really jazzed after that. And like, okay, well, it's time for me to do my own thing. Or, a really good song. I've come up with entire book plots based off of hearing a song for the first time, just because it was so powerful and in its tone and its mood that it just sparked something in me. So um, I end up telling kids who ask, where do you get your ideas, that everyone's affected by a lot of different things and everyone gets ideas, but the writer trains themselves to pay attention to those ideas and that inspiration when it happens and to catch it and like hold on to it. So yeah, I try to be open anytime.
Amazing. What type of books did you grow up reading, and did you have an all-time favorite?
Um, yeah, I grew up reading, it was mostly genre stuff, but it was also, some classics as well. So, mystery, sci-fi, but then I would also read, like, my parents were good about making things available. They knew I loved to read, and so they let me, um, you know, they gave me a lot of freedom to pick the things that I was interested in. So I loved Edgar Allan Poe as a kid. Um, he's fairly dark for a young kid to read, but I looking back on it, I'm like, oh, my parents were kind of cool about that. They could have steered me towards something else, but they let me dabble in stuff like that, and so that was really fun. Um, yeah, I liked a wide variety. Um, any favorites? Um, boy, I loved Lord of the Rings. Um, that's a pretty classic answer, but yeah, it's classic for a reason. Trying to think if there are any other. I remember one book that I read, and I tend not to go back and read things that I read back then because I just want to kind of preserve the memory. So I don't know how I'd feel about it now. There was a middle grade book called The Snow Spider. Um, that still I read it in fifth grade, and I still remember it. Just because it was so different, and I loved reading something that was it was sort of fantasy, but it was modern day, but it was kind of hard to define and describe. Um, and I remember thinking, this is just, I've never read anything like this in my life. Um, and I feel like that stuck with me because I don't tend to write single genre things. They tend to be mashups. Like even this last adventure, it's a contemporary technically, but there are dashes of fantasy in it. And then with my time travel series, I would see each of those books has its own. It's one series, but each has a tone that matches different themes. So the first one's very mystery based. The second one, there's a mystery element to all of them, but the second one definitely has a lot more fantasy elements. The third one, believe it or not, I would describe more as a war epic than anything else, because it's essentially three different warring timelines that kind of meet on one front. That's kind of the culmination of things. So I can't really write just one thing, and maybe that's why.
I love that. On the opposite side of that, now as an adult, do you have a favorite series or author that if they have something come out, it's like you
Mm-hmm.
can buy now, click now, as people say?
Well, my all-time favorite book is The Count of Monte Cristo. I would put that, number one on my list. I would say number two, maybe a tie for number two or two and three. I don't know, it's hard to choose, but um, Pride and Prejudice is an amazing book. And then going to more modern stuff, I'd say either somewhere in that second or third slot is called The Gone Away World by Nick Harkaway, which is it's funny. I would compare it to The Snow Spider in the sense of, I mean, they're nothing alike, but in the sense of it is so different that you just have to surrender to it and go with it, because you will not be able to tell where it's going or what the point of most of it is until towards the end. It's another book that I wouldn't have given the time of day, except a friend kept saying, read this. And finally I gave in and I was like, you're right. This is one of my all-time favorite books now. I loved The Night Circus. Brandon Sanderson's, pretty, he's pretty reliable as a good author, especially his epic fantasy. Blake Crouch writes really good sci-fi, just really compelling, nice sci-fi. Andy Weir writes good sci-fi as well. He's the guy who wrote The Martian. I feel like his greatest talent is he can take details that should bore you to tears, and he can still make it entertaining and interesting. And I think he's got a real singular talent for that. And as far as, I mean, I have probably most of my author friends are in YA and middle grade. And so for a lot of them, it's just an instant buy, whatever they put out. Joanna Meyer writes amazing fantasy books. She wrote one called Echo North that I would say is probably my favorite YA fantasy book. Dusty Bowling writes really compelling MG books. Let me think. It's a good opportunity to shout out some of my friends. I would say that's a good short list. If we had longer, I would sit here and brainstorm more, or I would just turn around and look at my shelf behind me. But that's a good list for a podcast.
Love that. Thanks. What would you tell someone just starting out with reading again?
You're supposed to enjoy it, so pick something you're going to like. I feel like especially some adults end up putting pressure on themselves and then on kids to like what's considered like legitimate literature, but that's total nonsense. Read what you love, and then once you warm back up to it, sure, maybe challenge yourself with some things that you might not have read before, or maybe you feel like are a little bit beyond you, but there's nothing wrong with just reading something because it's going to be fun. Read comic books. There are some amazingly well-written graphic novels and comic book series out there. And there are some that are kid-friendly as well, that I would, if there was a reluctant reader, that the first thing I would put in their hands are certain graphic novels and say, look, read this. And if you enjoy that, then we'll graduate you to some other things. But yeah, don't put pressure on yourself to read things that are profound all the time. And even if you want that, sometimes it doesn't mean you can't go back to fluff. There's nothing wrong with a popcorn book or something that's just going to entertain you. It's supposed to be enjoyable.
Love that. On the other side of that, what would you tell someone just starting to write their own book?
You will never stop. If you do it right, you will never stop learning and improving. And don't ever get to the point where you think you've figured it out. Because at that point you'll stop growing, and I can almost guarantee you it'll be at a point before your professional level. Because I've seen that happen. Don't be tempted to take shortcuts in learning your craft. Don't practice for a year and then say, well, I'm just going to self-publish. There's nothing wrong with self-publishing, of course, if you do it right. But if you want to write like professionally, if you want to be a published author, take it seriously. I'm not saying don't enjoy it. Of course, you got to love it first, but study the craft. That's when I would say stretch yourself and read things you wouldn't have thought to read. Get out there, and as you're learning, make friends with other aspiring writers who are at your similar level, and help each other. Be each other's beta readers. Be each other's accountability. Go to book and author events and meet people live, and meet authors and meet people who go to those events. And some people end up making lifelong friends and finding their critique groups by doing that. If you really want, it's definitely a community, and it's among published authors, it's a fairly small community. So if you really want to do it, then the sooner you can start making yourself a part of it, the better. Offer to beta read other people's work. Make yourself valuable in the community, and people will remember you. I had something else that I was going to share. What is it? What was it? When you're truly ready, and you feel like your manuscript is truly ready, follow every single painful, minute rule for every agent and every agency as far as their rules for querying. Be professional. And because if you query the wrong way, it's going in the trash. So don't take yourself out of the game just because you're not following their rules for submission.
Amazing. I love that. What's one thing that people are generally surprised to find out about you?
So I'm built like a football player, but almost everything I do is artsy. Not that I don't enjoy football. Sometimes I do. But I've been told I don't look like somebody who would write children's books or paint, or I'm a singer as well, and I do voiceover work, and I enjoy cooking. I guess my hobbies and my appearance don't necessarily match according to what some people think when they first see me. So that can surprise them.
Amazing. Is there anything you would like to say or add?
Well, here's one thing that I tell classes, that like if I teach writing classes, or if I go to school visits and things, one thing I tell them is for people thinking about writing, embrace your weird. So whatever makes you strange, weird, interesting, unique, steer into that when you're thinking about what you want to write and how you want to write. Because it's an irony that actually the more specific you are with letting who you are, your personality, your style spill out on the page, the more likely you are to find an audience. Actually, it's typically the ones that try to write too broad and please everyone that have a a harder time. Even of course there are exceptions to everything, but most of the powerful things that you experience in art are things that have a very strong point of view, and usually one that is unusual. So whatever, weird thing you like, just run at that and incorporate that into your art.
Amazing. Where's the best place for readers to find your book? I know a lot of readers love signed copies. Is that an option and the best place to connect with you?
Sure. So, yeah, there are some signed copies out there. It kind of depends on where I am at the moment, because wherever I go, I'll try to stop in with bookstores. I know there should be some in Powell's right now. If you're in Portland, if you're in the Midwest, there's some stores. So yeah, I try, but someone could reach out to me always if they want a signed copy, and I can connect them to stores that have them. Ryan Dalton Writes is my website. At Ryan Dalton on Twitter, or just Ryan Dalton on Instagram. And I'm on both fairly frequently, so anybody can reach out if they want to connect with me.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being here today. We're super excited we got to talk to you and all the amazing things you inspired us with. We will be dropping the links you talked about in the show notes. That way everyone can find them. And thank you so much again.
Hey, thanks for having me. This was great.